Discussion of the literature. Work in this field began to emerge in the 1980s. Scholars, many of whom were also activists, began to develop an anti-apartheid feminism that acknowledged the harm done by a national liberation movement that could not fully grapple with gendered oppression during its long struggle. Marxism was influential in this early work. Scholars working during the late apartheid years were therefore concerned with 1. How gendered oppression had been integral to the racial capitalism that anti-apartheid activists were fighting, and 2. How feminism and nationalism were linked. The second theme will be explored in detail here, as it has recently been attracting more attention from a new wave of scholars. On the first point, Belinda Bozzoli's 1983 essay, Marxism, Feminism and South African Studies, examined the patchwork quilt of patriarchies through which the migrant labour system foundational to apartheid had developed. Probing gendered histories of domestic service, factory work, nursing and mining followed. Walker's Women and Resistance in South Africa, first published in 1982, with a second edition in 1991, was the germinal study connecting the gendered foundations of apartheid rule with women's development of strategies of collective resistance. The book emerged from Walker's University of Cape Town thesis, drawing upon archives, activist memoirs, and interviews about the Federation of South African Women. But it also offers a deeper history of women's urban migration, rural struggles, and links with male-led organizations, extending far beyond FETSO. Walker raised two central questions that shaped subsequent scholarship. First was the question of how apartheid-era South African women's organizing was both emboldened and constrained by the movement for national liberation out of which it emerged. Second was the question of how, why, and to what consequences motherhood has united South African women. In the first edition, Walker contended that both FETSO women's lack of organizational autonomy and tendency to unite as mothers limited their feminism, seeing women as bound to both patriarchal politics and poems. In the preface to the second edition, she backed away from seeing maternal appeals as primarily conservative, following pointed critiques of this approach as reductive and predicated on Western understandings of family life as a refuge from the public sphere. Hasim's 2006 Women's Organizations and Democracy in South Africa, Contesting Authority, pursued the question of women's organizational autonomy more fully, extending her examination, The ANC in Exile, Women's Grassroots Organizations in the 1980s, and the Democratic Transition. Like Walker, Hasim adjudged that the subordination of South African women's organizations to the increasingly pressing needs of its national liberation movement ultimately constrained the gender transformational potential of the democratic transition. Nomboni Sogasa's essay on 1950s women's organizing in her 2007 edited volume, Women in South African History, challenged the theoretical premises of both of Walker's central questions, as well as Julia Wells's maintenance of the position that the motherist politics deriving anti-past protests were fundamentally conservative. The heart of the earlier struggles is the fact that African women were homeless by state design, Gasa argued. Quote, their central struggle against the past laws, which were a tangible way of infringing their rights, was, in fact, a struggle to be in the public domain at the same time as a struggle for free movement, end quote. Building on Gasa's intervention and on the questions about motherhood Walker posited in her own auto-critique, scholars have begun to address the histories of motherhood in Southern Africa that gave maternal politics very different meanings for black and white women, to examine how family tensions played out politically during the liberation struggle. The most important counterpoint to Walker's and Hassim's argument that female activists' lack of autonomy from the national liberation movement limited their feminism remains Zine Makubane's extensive 2010 essay, Attitudes Towards Feminism Among Women in the ANC, 1950 to 1990, a theoretical reinterpretation. In the Road to Democracy series. Revisiting Walker's and Hassim's sources and examining additional interviews, activist memoirs, and archives of FEDSAW and the ANC, Makubane argues that autonomy was not a viable option. Groups like FEDSAW derive strength from their roots in political groups and trade unions. Further, she contends that Black women's emphasis on motherhood did not entrench patriarchy, but rather asserted Black women's moral leadership over white women in a growing popular struggle. Drawing on women's own conceptions of their activism, she shows how political motherhood in FEDSAW and in subsequent movements influenced by FEDSAW was an ideology rooted in Black women's experiences of not only caring for their own children, but also taking community leadership roles on the basis of their maternal authority. New scholarship is only beginning to grapple with the challenges and opportunities, transformations in the political meanings and everyday experiences of family brought to women and to men during apartheid and in the transition to democracy.